The trench that became a home. I can't tell you exactly when the war began for me. You might think I'm referring to the day I was sent to Italy, or maybe the moment I stepped into that hellish trench, but no, it was before that. It was when I first heard the call to serve, when I first learned what it meant to lose a piece of yourself in a faraway place. But let's go back to Cassino. The first days in that trench weren't much different from the stories I'd heard. The rumors of cold, mud, and constant bombardment came true the moment I set foot in it. The only thing that seemed to make sense in that madness was the dirt. It was everywhere, up to your knees, under your skin, sticking to your boots, and making your clothes feel like a second skin. There was no escape from it. Not for me, and certainly not for anyone else in my squad. We'd been dug in for what felt like months, but I'm sure it was only a couple of weeks. The days started blending together after a while. No one bothered counting anymore. Time had no meaning. Every day felt the same, wet, cold, and filled with the thundering roar of distant artillery that rattled your bones even when you weren't anywhere near it. But we stayed. We had to. The mission, the orders, they all came down to one thing: hold the line. The first night I spent in that trench, I couldn't shake the feeling that the earth itself was alive beneath me. The ground groaned as the shells tore through the sky, and the wind didn't help either, making everything seem more alive, more threatening. It was like the whole landscape was waiting for something. Or maybe it was just me, starting to lose my mind from the strain. I remember looking at my watch that night. I'd worn it for months, more for the habit than anything, and yet it felt useless. The time was irrelevant. I knew it, but it still comforted me to know I could look at it, even if it was just a futile gesture. When I did look, I realized the hands weren't moving anymore. They hadn't for days. I don't know how long I sat there in that trench, watching the other men around me. We didn't talk much. There was no point. What words could you say when the world around you was falling apart? But there were moments, small, fleeting, when you'd catch a glance from one of the others, and for a second, there was something there. Understanding. A shared burden. In that trench, everyone knew what the other was going through. The dirt, the cold, the fear. It wasn't new to any of us. And then there were the sounds you'll never forget. The constant cracking of gunfire from the German lines, the sharp echoing thud of mortars landing just far enough away to give you a false sense of security. And over it all, the eerie silence that followed when everything stopped. You never knew if it would start again. It was worse, somehow, when it was quiet. It made you wonder what was coming next. I didn't know it then, but that silence was the beginning of something I would never fully understand. That night, after the barrage subsided, something changed. Maybe it was the cold seeping deeper into my bones, or maybe it was just the weight of everything that had happened up until that point. But I remember looking around the trench and seeing my comrades in a way I hadn't before. We were more than just soldiers. We were all in the same mess, literally and figuratively. The days dragged on, each one starting and ending with the same bleak monotony. We lived for small victories, the rare moments when the rain stopped long enough for us to eat a warm meal, or the brief lulls in the fighting where we could close our eyes for a minute. It didn't take long before you couldn't remember what it felt like to be dry. Every time we'd move, we'd slip on the slick mud, dragging ourselves through it as if we were part of the landscape, sinking into it with each step. But then something unexpected happened. Amidst the never-ending days, one of the guys, a tall fella named Jimmy, started telling jokes. At first, they were little things. A funny story from home, or a bad impersonation of our commander. It was nothing that would make you laugh out loud, but it was enough to bring a little light into that dark, cold trench. Slowly, everyone else started joining in. Not because we felt like laughing, but because it was the only way to hold on to a sliver of humanity. Even though we didn't have much, those moments, those small fragments of life before the war, became our lifeline. We clung to them like they were the only things keeping us from disappearing completely into that godforsaken hole in the ground. It wasn't much, but in those moments, we weren't just soldiers anymore. We were people, even if it was only for a few minutes. As time went on, we began to notice things that didn't quite make sense. Shadows moving in the distance, figures we couldn't quite place, flickers of light where there should have been none. Maybe it was just the toll the war had taken on us. Maybe it was the constant stress that made us start seeing things. But there was something unsettling about it all, something that made me question if there were forces at work here that we didn't fully understand. It was hard to say what was real anymore. But the trench itself, was becoming more than just a hole in the ground. It felt like it was becoming part of us, and we were becoming part of it. The boundaries between soldier and trench, between man and earth, began to blur. Sometimes I swore I could hear the earth breathing beneath me, as if it was watching, waiting for us to slip further down into its embrace. And the weather, always the weather. Cold rain, sharp winds, constant chill that gnawed at your bones. I remember one night when the wind was so fierce it sounded like someone was screaming just beyond our lines. It was hard to tell if it was the wind or something else, but it sent a shiver down my spine. In a way, it felt like the earth was trying to speak to us. But what was it saying? It was only when we got the order to move up again that we realized how much the trench had become our home. Despite the cold, despite the endless fear, there was something strangely comforting about it. It was the only place that hadn't changed in weeks. It had become a refuge in its own strange way, a place where we could be ourselves, if only for a moment. The day we were ordered to leave that trench, I felt like I was being torn away from something I didn't quite understand. As we packed our things, I couldn't help but look back one last time. It wasn't much, a hole in the ground filled with mud and fear, but it had been ours. And in the strange, twisted reality of war, it had become the only home I knew. But I knew, too, that what awaited us ahead would be far worse. The road from there led deeper into the heart of the war, and there was no turning back now. We moved out the next day, leaving behind the trench that had somehow kept us alive all this time. The air felt different now, thicker, heavier, as though the earth itself had swallowed something from us. That trench had been a fortress in its own right, offering a sort of twisted comfort in a madness of war. But we couldn't stay. Orders were orders, and our objective hadn't changed. The Germans were still ahead, dug in and determined to hold Cassino. The march up the mountain was a blur of exhaustion and fear. The further we moved, the more oppressive the landscape seemed. The hills were jagged, sharp, as though they had been torn apart by some ancient force. We were exposed now, vulnerable. There was no cover, no place to hide. The shelling began almost immediately. You'd hear the distant whine of the incoming rounds before the earth shook beneath you, and then the world would explode. I can't tell you how many times I dropped to the ground, heart racing, praying that this time, the next round wouldn't find me. But it always did. Or at least it seemed that way. We kept moving, taking cover whenever we could. And when we couldn't, we ran, each man trying to outrun death. It wasn't easy. The mud from the previous storm made the hills slick, and I found myself slipping more than once, cursing under my breath. But there was no time for curses. There was only survival. By the time we reached the edge of the German lines, I had lost track of how many men were left in my squad. The numbers didn't matter anymore. It was just about staying alive. I tried to focus, to keep my mind clear, but the fear was always there, gnawing at the back of my thoughts. Every step I took felt like it could be my last. The fighting intensified as we moved forward. We engaged with the enemy, small skirmishes here and there, but it was nothing compared to what we'd seen back in the trench. The Germans were well entrenched, well prepared, and they fought like animals, fierce, relentless. There were moments when I'd catch a glimpse of one of them, just a shadow in the distance, and I'd think to myself, how are we supposed to win this? The days blurred into one another again. It wasn't just the exhaustion or the constant battle. It was the weight of what we were doing. It was the sense that we weren't just fighting for victory, but for something else, something deeper, something darker. And I started to realize it wasn't just the enemy we had to worry about. It was the toll war was taking on us. I'd seen it in the eyes of my friends, in the way they carried themselves now, distant, hardened. They weren't the same men I'd met back at base. None of us were. One night, as we huddled in a makeshift shelter after a particularly brutal firefight, I found myself staring at the stars, trying to remember what life had been like before this. But the memories were fading, slipping away like sand through my fingers. The more I tried to hold on, the more they seemed to vanish. The others were quieter that night. Normally, someone would break the silence with a joke or a story, but not tonight. Tonight, we all felt it, the weight of the war pressing down on us. Even Jimmy, who had been the one to keep spirit high, was unusually still, his eyes lost in the darkness. The trench had been our home in a twisted way, but this was something else. This was the heart of it. The real war. The war that didn't care about your hopes or dreams. The war that would grind you down until there was nothing left. As the night wore on, I couldn't sleep. The sound of distant gunfire was too constant, too relentless. I had no idea if it was friendly fire or if we were in danger, but it didn't matter. Sleep had become a luxury. Even when you could close your eyes, you never knew if you'd wake up. The next day, we launched an assault. I don't remember much of the details. It all happened too fast, like a dream you can't quite grasp. One minute, we were advancing. The next, I was pinned down by enemy fire. The noise was deafening, the smoke thick in the air. It felt like the world itself was screaming. And then something happened that I still can't explain. It wasn't just the chaos of battle or the adrenaline pumping through my veins. It was something deeper. I felt the earth beneath me again, like it was reaching up, pulling me into its grasp. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down, and I could see things clearly, almost too clearly. I don't know what I expected in that moment, whether it was the end or something else entirely. But what I saw was Jimmy running toward me through the smoke. He was shouting my name, but I couldn't hear him. Not really. His lips moved, but the words got lost in the explosion of sound. And then he was gone, disappearing into the chaos of the battlefield. I don't know how I made it out of that skirmish. I don't know how I survived the day. But by some miracle I did. I woke up hours later on the edge of a field with no memory of how I got there. The others had moved on. I was alone, and the silence that followed that realization was even worse than the battle. I couldn't bring myself to go back to the others, not yet. There was something broken in me now, something that the war had taken, something I wasn't sure I could ever find again. But I had to go back. I couldn't leave them behind, no matter how much I wanted to. I remember the first time I saw Cassino. It wasn't what I expected. I thought it would be a city, a stronghold. But it wasn't. It was a pile of rubble, a heap of stones and dust. The Germans were still dug in, still holding their ground, but it felt like the place was already lost. It was as if the land itself had turned its back on us. But we kept moving. And somehow we kept fighting. Because there was no other choice. I don't know how long it was before I finally caught up with the rest of my squad. It could have been hours or days. Time didn't matter much anymore. I just kept moving like the others with no real goal in mind except survival. When I finally found them, sitting in a small clearing at the foot of a hill, they barely looked up. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they didn't recognize me. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken weight of everything we'd been through. But we didn't have time to dwell on it. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Cassino was still in front of us. The days that followed were a blur. I don't remember the details as clearly as I should. There was too much going on, too much fighting, too much fear. But I remember the feeling. That same feeling that had been with me from the moment I stepped into that first trench, that feeling of being hunted, of being a part of something far larger than yourself. It was like we were all just pieces in a game we didn't understand. Cassino never felt like a victory. Even when we finally pushed the Germans back, even when the city was in our hands, it didn't feel like we'd won. What had we won? A pile of rubble, a ruined city, lives lost, both ours and theirs. There was no triumph in it. No joy. It was just a moment, a fleeting fragment of time when we could breathe, when we could say, we survived. But that was all. I don't know what happened to Jimmy after that. I'd heard stories. People said he was among those who didn't make it, that he was hit during the final push. But I never saw his body. I never saw him again. I told myself I'd go back for him, that I'd find him, but I never did. And somehow, I couldn't bring myself to feel guilty about it. Because that's the thing about war. It teaches you that survival is a lonely thing. You do what you have to do to stay alive, and sometimes that means leaving the people you care about behind. It's a harsh truth, but it's the only truth. The days after the battle were strange. The fighting had stopped, but the war was far from over. The remnants of our squad were scattered, picking through the rubble, searching for anything useful. There were no celebrations, no parades, just silence, and the occasional sound of distant artillery. It was like the war had been paused for a moment, but we all knew it would start again. It always did. I remember sitting on the edge of a ruined building one afternoon, looking out over what was left of Cassino. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the devastation. There was something peaceful about it, something eerie. The air was still, almost too still, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. But it didn't last. The peace was fragile, and I knew it. I looked over at the others, still moving through the wreckage, and for a moment, I saw them as they had been before the war. They were just men, just human beings trying to make sense of something that had no sense. I could see the same lost look in their eyes that I felt in mine. We were all just trying to hold on, to survive, to make it through to the next day. I don't know if I ever found the answers I was looking for. I don't know if any of us did. But I do know that for a time, that trench, those days spent huddled in the dirt, hiding from the world, became something more than just a place. It became a part of us. A strange, twisted home. In the end, when I left Italy and came back to the States, nothing felt the same. How could it? I had left a piece of myself behind, buried somewhere in the mud, in the ruins, in the silence of the trenches. And when I came back, I was a different man. Not better. Not worse. Just different. The war didn't end when we left Cassino. It followed us home in ways I can't fully explain. The memories of the trench, of the men I fought beside, of the things I saw haunted me for years. But there's one thing I've come to realize: the war never truly leaves you. Not entirely. It becomes a part of you, like a scar you can never see, a weight you can never fully shed. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. All I know is that we fought, we survived, and somehow we made it through. And even though we left the trenches behind, they stayed with us. Maybe that's what it means to truly be home. Maybe home isn't a place. Maybe it's just the people you carry with you, the memories that never really leave. And so I tell this story about the trench that became home, not to remind anyone of the horrors of war, but to show that even in the darkest places, there is a sliver of light. A moment when you realize that no matter how bad it gets, you're still alive. You're still here. And that's something worth fighting for.